The fluorescent lights of the Harris County Sheriff's Department flickered with their usual tired rhythm as Detective Sarah Chun leaned back in her chair, the springs groaning under the shift of weight. It was March 2024, and the stack of cold case files on her desk had become as familiar as the coffee-stained mug she'd inherited from her predecessor. 41 years old, with streaks of premature gray threading through her black hair, Sarah had spent the last 3 years of her career doing what most considered impossible: breathing life into cases that time had tried to bury. The Houston heat was already building outside, even at 7 in the morning. Through the grimy window of her cramped office, she could see the city waking up, oblivious to the ghosts she spent her days chasing. Her desk was a controlled chaos of manila folders, each one representing a life interrupted, a family frozen in the amber of unanswered questions. But today, her attention was fixed on 2 particular files that had arrived on her desk through a peculiar convergence of events. The first file was labeled Jessica Marie Thornton, Houston, Texas, 1983. The second read Amanda K. Sullivan, Clearwater, Florida, 1983. On the surface, they had nothing in common except the year. Jessica had been a 23-year-old graduate student at the University of Houston, studying marine biology. Amanda had been a 25-year-old real estate agent in Clearwater, known for her infectious laugh and her habit of wearing bright yellow sundresses. They'd lived over 1,000 miles apart, moved in different circles, had different dreams. Yet something about these cases had been nagging at Sarah for weeks, ever since a routine DNA database update had pinged with a partial match that seemed statistically impossible. She'd spent countless nights going over the evidence logs, the witness statements typed on actual typewriters, the photographs that had faded to sepia tones. The connection was there. She could feel it the way sailors feel a storm coming, but it remained just out of reach, like trying to remember a word that sits on the tip of your tongue. Sarah picked up the crime scene photo of Jessica Thornton. The young woman had been found in her off-campus apartment on a sweltering August evening in 1983. A neighbor had noticed her door ajar and, after calling out with no response, had reluctantly pushed it open. Jessica was on her living room floor, her marine biology textbooks scattered around her like fallen leaves. The medical examiner had ruled it strangulation, but there were no signs of forced entry, no signs of sexual assault, nothing taken from the apartment. It was as if someone she knew had simply walked in and decided to end her life. The lead detective in 1983, a man named Frank Holloway who'd since passed away from lung cancer, had interviewed everyone in Jessica's life. Her boyfriend had an airtight alibi, spending that weekend with his parents in Dallas. Her lab partners, her professors, her neighbors all checked out. The case went cold within 6 months, filed away in a basement that flooded twice before the department went digital in 2003. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Detective Marcus Webb in Clearwater, Florida. They'd been collaborating for 2 weeks now, ever since Sarah had reached out about the DNA match. The text was simple: call me. New development. Her heart rate picked up as she dialed. Marcus answered on the first ring, his Florida drawl immediately apparent. He was older than Sarah, 58 and counting down to retirement, but he'd caught fire on this case in a way she recognized, the way cold cases sometimes grabbed hold of detectives who'd seen too much death and needed to believe that justice could still reach backward through time. "Marcus, what V you got?" Sarah asked, switching her phone to speaker so she could take notes. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said, and she could hear papers rustling on his end. "I've been going through Amanda Sullivan's personal effects, the stuff her sister finally agreed to let us look at after all these years. Found her day planner from 1983. Sarah leaned forward. And she had a trip planned to Houston in July of that year, 3 weeks before she died. Marcus paused for effect. She was there for a real estate conference at the Hyatt Regency downtown. 5 days, July 18th through the 22nd. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to shift in her mind, like tectonic plates finding new alignment. Jessica Thornton died August 6, 1983. Amanda Sullivan died September 2, 1983. Both young professional women. Both in their apartments. Both strangled with no signs of forced entry or robbery. Did Amanda know anyone in Houston? Sarah asked, already pulling up her computer to cross-reference names. Her sister says no. But here's the thing, Sarah. Marcus's voice dropped lower. I found a receipt tucked in the day planner. A bar receipt from a place called the Rusty Anchor, dated July 20th, 1983. 2 drinks, paid in cash, but there's a credit card number written on the back in Amanda's handwriting. Like she was taking down someone's information, maybe someone she met. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. The Rusty Anchor. I know that place. It was a grad student hangout near the university. Closed down in the 90s. She felt the electricity of a case breaking open. Marcus, Jessica Thornton, was a regular there. Her roommate mentioned it in the original interview. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with implication. So we've got 2 women, both strangled in their apartments in 1983, both with possible connections to the same bar in Houston, Marcus said slowly. And we've got a partial DNA match from both crime scenes that didn't exist in any database until 3 months ago when some guy in Oregon got arrested for drunk driving. Sarah pulled up the DNA report. The suspect's name was printed in bold. Robert Vincent Carver, age 64, arrested in Portland, Oregon, February 14, 2024. The DNA had been routine, standard procedure for all arrests in Oregon since 2021. The match to the 1983 cases had been only partial, 13 markers instead of the usual 16, but it was enough to establish familial relationship. Robert Vincent Carver wasn't their killer, but someone in his immediate family was. Sarah had already started building the family tree. Robert had 2 brothers, both deceased. Michael Carver died in a car accident in 1997, and James Carver died of a heart attack in 2019. James had been 62 when he died, which would have made him 21 in 1983. He'd lived in Houston from 1981 to 1984, working as a bartender while supposedly taking classes at Houston Community College. Where did James Carver work in 1983? Marcus asked, though Sarah suspected he already knew. She pulled up the employment records she'd requested from the Texas Workforce Commission. The Rusty Anchor. He was the night bartender from April 1983 until the place let him go in November 1983. 2 months after Amanda Sullivan died. They let him go? Why? Sarah scanned the old records, squinting at the faded photocopies. Customer complaints. Multiple women reported feeling uncomfortable, said he was too persistent, wouldn't take no for an answer. Management fired him to avoid problems. She looked up at the photo of James Carver she'd pulled from his driver's license records. He'd been handsome in a dangerous way, with dark eyes and a smile that probably charmed easily. In 1983, he would have been young, confident, working in a bar full of college students and young professionals letting loose after long days. Marcus, we need to dig into James Carver's entire life. Where he lived after Houston, who he associated with, any other complaints or arrests. Already on it, Marcus replied. I've got calls out to Portland PD and the FBI. If this guy moved around, if there are other victims, we need to know. Sarah stared at the photos of Jessica and Amanda, young women frozen forever in their 20s. Their futures erased by someone who'd walked away and lived another 36 years before his heart gave out. The injustice of it burned in her chest. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice careful. I talked to Amanda's sister this morning, told her about the Houston connection. She broke down, said Amanda had come home from that conference different. Quieter. Jumpy. Her sister asked her what was wrong, and Amanda said she'd met someone, but it didn't work out, and she didn't want to talk about it. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining Amanda Sullivan in that bar in July 1983, probably tired from a day of real estate seminars, maybe looking to unwind with a drink, and James Carver behind the bar, pouring her something cold, flashing that smile, making conversation. Had he followed her back to Florida? Or had he done something to her in Houston that made her a target later? We need to find out everywhere James Carver traveled in 1983, Sarah said. Credit card records, work schedules, anything. And we need to notify the families. After 41 years, they deserve to know we're close. Marcus agreed, and they ended the call with promises to update each other within hours. Sarah sat in the quiet of her office, the morning sun now streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. Somewhere in Texas, Jessica Thornton's parents were in their 80s now, if they were still alive. In Florida, Amanda Sullivan's sister was 59, had spent most of her life wondering who had stolen her sister's future. Sarah pulled out a fresh legal pad and began making a timeline. July 1983. Amanda in Houston meets James Carver. August 1983. Jessica murdered in Houston. September 1983. Amanda murdered in Florida. November 1983. James Carver fired from the Rusty Anchor. December 1983. James Carver leaves Houston. The pattern was there, emerging from the fog of decades. A young man with a taste for violence, working a job that gave him access to vulnerable women, and the rage that came when they rejected him. Sarah had seen it before, the toxic combination of charm and entitlement that turned deadly when wounded. Her computer pinged with an email from the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. They'd run James Carver's name through their database. 3 unsolved murders in the 1980s and 1990s matched the pattern. Women in their 20s, strangled in their apartments, no forced entry. 1 in Denver in 1986. 1 in Phoenix in 1991. 1 in Sacramento in 1995. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she opened the attached files. Each crime scene photo showed the same careful staging, the same lack of physical evidence, the same ghost of a killer who knew how to slip in and out of lives without leaving traces. James Carver had moved west after leaving Texas, hopping from city to city, probably working service industry jobs that let him meet new people, new potential victims. And he died peacefully in his sleep in Portland in 2019, never arrested, never questioned, never held accountable. But his DNA had finally betrayed him, pulled from skin cells under Amanda Sullivan's fingernails that had sat in an evidence freezer for 41 years, waiting for science to catch up with evil. The conference room at the Harris County Sheriff's Department felt smaller than usual, packed with faces Sarah had assembled over the past 72 hours. Lieutenant Patricia Vance sat at the head of the table, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression unreadable. Marcus Webb had flown in from Florida the night before, looking exhausted but determined. 2 FBI agents, Jennifer Park and David Sullivan, no relation to the victim, occupied the far end, their federal badges clipped to their belts like warnings. And then there was Thomas Thornton, Jessica's younger brother, now a 58-year-old high school history teacher from Austin, who'd driven through the night when Sarah called to tell him they'd finally found answers. Thomas sat with his hands folded on the table, his knuckles white with tension. He had his sister's eyes, Sarah noticed, that same deep brown that seemed to hold oceans of unspoken thoughts. He hadn't said much since arriving, just a quiet thank you that nearly broke Sarah's composure. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah stood to present what they'd uncovered. She'd barely slept in 3 days, surviving on gas station coffee and the adrenaline that came from watching a decades-old puzzle finally reveal its picture. The whiteboard behind her was covered in photographs, timeline markers, and red string connecting the dots that had taken 41 years to see. James Edward Carver, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. Born March 15, 1962, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Died January 8, 2019, in Portland, Oregon. Between those 2 dates, we now believe he murdered at least 5 women, possibly more. She pointed to the first row of photographs. Jessica Thornton, August 1983, Houston. Amanda Sullivan, September 1983, Clearwater, Florida. Then she moved to the next row, photos that had arrived from the FBI database. Rebecca Chen, March 1986, Denver, Colorado. Melissa Rodriguez, June 1991, Phoenix, Arizona. And finally, Catherine Walsh, November 1995, Sacramento, California. All 5 women were in their 20s. All 5 were strangled in their apartments. All 5 knew their killer well enough to let him inside. The DNA from skin cells, hair follicles, and in one case, saliva on a coffee cup all matched James Carver. We've got him. Thomas Thornton's breath hitched, a sound so small it might have gone unnoticed if the room hadn't been holding its collective breath. He raised his hands slightly, like a student seeking permission to speak. My parents, he said, his voice cracking. They died not knowing. My father in 2003, my mother in 2011. They spent 20 and 28 years respectively thinking Jessica's killer was out there, walking free, maybe killing other people's daughters. Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over the room. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. I'm so sorry they didn't get to see this day. Marcus Webb cleared his throat, drawing attention to his end of the table. He'd been working the Amanda Sullivan case for only 3 weeks, but Sarah could see it had already carved itself into his features, adding new lines around his eyes. Amanda's sister, Catherine, is flying in tomorrow, he said. She's 73 now, has stage 3 lung cancer. The doctors give her maybe 6 months. When I told her we'd found who killed her sister, she cried for an hour straight. Then she asked me if she could spit on his grave. One of the FBI agents, Jennifer Park, leaned forward. She was young, maybe 32, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. We've been working with Portland PD to reconstruct James Carver's life after he left California in 1995. It's not pretty. She clicked a remote, and the screen behind Sarah illuminated with a timeline. After the Sacramento murder, he went quiet for a long time. Married a woman named Linda Parsons in 1998, had 2 kids with her. Worked as a warehouse supervisor. By all accounts, he was a model citizen. Then why did he stop killing? Lieutenant Vance asked, voicing the question that had been bothering Sarah since the FBI files arrived. Agent Sullivan, the older of the 2 federal officers, answered, We think he didn't stop wanting to. We think he stopped being able to. He pulled up another image, a police report from 2001. Domestic violence call to the Carver residence. Linda filed a restraining order, claimed James had become increasingly controlling and violent. She took the kids and left. The divorce was finalized in 2002. Sarah picked up the thread. After the divorce, James's life fell apart. Lost his job, filed for bankruptcy, was evicted from 3 different apartments between 2002 and 2005. He was working day labor jobs, drinking heavily. The FBI profilers think that the structure of his earlier life, the marriage and kids, had been keeping his impulses in check. Once that was gone, he fell into a depression that was probably too deep for him to hunt effectively. Thomas Thornton spoke again, his voice harder now. So he just got to live out the rest of his life? Made it to 62 years old? Had kids, had grandkids probably, just lived like he hadn't destroyed 5 families? Sarah met his eyes. Yes, that's exactly what happened. And I know how unfair that feels. Unfair doesn't begin to cover it, Thomas said. He stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. Jessica was going to cure something. She used to tell me that all the time when we were kids. She was going to be a marine biologist and discover something that would save the coral reefs, save the oceans. She was brilliant and kind, and she used to make me breakfast every Saturday even though I was an annoying little brother. And some bartender who couldn't handle rejection just decided her life didn't matter. The room stayed silent. What could anyone say to that kind of grief, the kind that had been waiting 41 years to be properly named and directed? Marcus Webb was the one who finally spoke. Thomas, I can't give you back your sister. None of us can give back any of these women or the lives they should have lived. But what we can do is make sure everyone knows what James Carver was. We can make sure his family knows. We can warn them to watch for the same patterns in his sons. And we can check every single place he ever lived or worked for more victims. Because I guarantee you, there are more. Sarah nodded. We've already started. We have records showing James Carver worked at bars and restaurants in 8 different cities between 1981 and 1995. We're pulling missing persons reports and unsolved homicides from each of those locations for the time periods he was there. It's going to take months, maybe years, but we're going to find every single person he hurt. Agent Park added, we're also looking at his associates. Did he have friends who covered for him? Did anyone suspect him and stay quiet? We're interviewing everyone we can find who knew him during the 1980s and 1990s. Lieutenant Vance finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years in law enforcement. This is going to be a media storm. Once we go public with this, every news outlet in the country is going to want the story. Cold cases solved, DNA breakthrough, multiple states, decades of investigation. We need to be prepared for that, and we need to make sure the families are protected from the circus. Sarah had been dreading this part. She'd seen what media attention could do to grieving families, how reporters would camp outside homes, how social media would dissect every detail of the victims' lives, looking for reasons why they'd been chosen. But the public also deserved to know. Other families with unsolved cases from the 1980s and 1990s deserved to know that this killer had been identified, that their loved ones' cases might finally have answers. We'll schedule a press conference for Monday, Lieutenant Vance continued. That gives us 4 days to notify all the families, prepare statements, and coordinate with the other jurisdictions. Sarah, this is your case. You're going to be the public face of it. Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd always hated being on camera, hated the way her words got twisted and edited, hated the performance of it all. But she nodded, understood. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, dividing up tasks and establishing protocols. Marcus would coordinate with Florida authorities. The FBI agents would handle the multi-state investigation and work with Portland PD on interviewing Carver's surviving family members. Sarah would lead the Houston end and prepare for the media onslaught. When the room finally cleared, only Thomas Thornton remained, staring at Jessica's photograph on the evidence board. Sarah approached slowly, unsure of what comfort she could possibly offer. I need to see where it happened, Thomas said without looking at her. The apartment where she died. Is it still there? Sarah hesitated. It's a different building now. They tore down the old complex in 1997, built luxury condos. But I can show you where it was. Thomas nodded. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. He turned to face her then, and Sarah saw something in his expression that she'd seen in too many families over the years. The particular agony of closure that came too late. The bittersweet poison of finally knowing while simultaneously understanding that knowing changed nothing. Jessica was still gone. Their parents had still died without answers. The last 41 years had still happened. Detective Chun, Thomas said quietly, "Thank you for not forgetting her. Thank you for caring about a case that was older than you are." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them back. She was your sister. She mattered. She still matters. After Thomas left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the faces of 5 dead women and 1 dead killer. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song. Outside, Houston traffic created its evening symphony of horns and engines. Somewhere in Florida, Catherine Sullivan was packing a bag for her flight to Texas, probably running her fingers over old photographs of a sister who'd never gotten to be old. In Colorado and Arizona and California, other families were about to receive phone calls that would crack open decades of carefully constructed scar tissue. And in Portland, Oregon, James Carver's 2 sons, now in their late 20s, were about to learn that their father had been a monster. Sarah's phone buzzed with an email from Portland PD. The subject line read, "Carver interview scheduled. Sons agree to talk." She opened it, scanning the details. Daniel Carver, age 28, and Michael Carver, age 26, had both agreed to be interviewed about their father. They claimed they'd had minimal contact with him after their parents' divorce, but they were willing to share whatever they knew. Sarah replied confirming she'd be on a flight to Portland within 48 hours. Then she gathered her files, turned off the lights, and walked out into the warm Houston night, carrying the weight of 5 women who deserved better and 1 man who'd escaped earthly justice but would forever be remembered as exactly what he was. The coffee shop in Northwest Portland had the artisanal, reclaimed wood aesthetic that seemed mandatory in this part of the city. Sarah sat in a corner booth, Marcus across from her, both of them watching the entrance. Daniel and Michael Carver were due to arrive in 10 minutes, and Sarah could feel the familiar pre-interview tension coiling in her stomach. These conversations were always delicate, especially when you had to tell someone that their father was a serial killer. Marcus stirred his 3rd espresso, the tiny spoon clinking against porcelain. "You ever done one of these before?" he asked. "Family of the perpetrator interview?" "Twice," Sarah replied. "Once was a grandmother who insisted we had the wrong person until we showed her the DNA evidence. Then she just went silent, Didn't say another word for the entire interview. The other was a daughter who said she'd always known something was wrong with her dad, that she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to prove it. Which one do you think these boys are gonna be? Sarah shrugged, watching rain streak down the window. Hard to say. Their mother divorced Carver when they were young, got them away from him. They might not remember much. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of wet April air and two men who looked nothing alike despite being brothers. Daniel Carver was tall and broad-shouldered, with his father's dark eyes but a softer face, like someone had taken James Carver's features and smoothed out all the hard edges. Michael was smaller, wiry, with lighter hair and a nervous energy that showed in the way he scanned the coffee shop before spotting the detectives. They approached the booth and Sarah stood, extending her hand. Daniel, Michael, thank you for meeting with us. I know this can't be easy. Daniel shook her hand firmly, his palm dry despite the rain. His brother's handshake was briefer, more hesitant. They slid into the booth, and a barista appeared to take their orders. Black coffee for Daniel, green tea for Michael. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken dread. Sarah had learned over the years that there was no gentle way to deliver this kind of information, no soft language that could cushion the blow of learning your parent was a murderer. So she was direct. Your father, James Carver, has been connected through DNA evidence to the murders of 5 women between 1983 and 1995. We believe there may be more victims we haven't identified yet. Michael's teacup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. Daniel's expression barely changed, but Sarah noticed his jaw clench, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. How many? Daniel asked, his voice flat. 5 confirmed. Jessica Thornton in Houston, Texas. Amanda Sullivan in Clearwater, Florida. Rebecca Chen in Denver. Melissa Rodriguez in Phoenix. Catherine Walsh in Sacramento. All between 1983 and 1995, before you were born or when you were very young. Michael looked like he might be sick. He pressed a hand to his mouth, breathing through his nose. Daniel remained still, his gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that reminded her uncomfortably of James Carver's driver's license photo. Our mother, Daniel said slowly. She knew something was wrong with him. That's why she left. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What did she tell you about him? Daniel glanced at his brother, some silent communication passing between them. Michael nodded almost imperceptibly. She said he was dangerous, that he hurt her and that he'd hurt us too if we stayed. We were 7 and 5 when she packed us up in the middle of the night and drove to her sister's place in Seattle. Filed for divorce, got a restraining order, changed our last name back to her maiden name for a while. We switched back to Carver when we were teenagers because it was easier for paperwork, but we never saw him after we left. Did he try to contact you? Marcus asked. Letters, Michael said, speaking for the first time. His voice was quiet, almost fragile. For years, he sent letters to our aunt's house. Mom would burn them without reading them. When I turned 18, I found one before she could destroy it. He pulled out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward them. I took a photo of it before she found out. Thought I might want it someday, proof that he at least tried to be a father. Sarah read the letter on the screen, and ice water seemed to replace the blood in her veins. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike in its precision. It was dated June 1999. Dear Michael, I hope you're doing well in school. I think about you and your brother every day. Your mother doesn't understand me. She never did. Women rarely do. They make promises they don't keep. They smile and laugh and make you think they care, and then they turn on you. They betray you. But you're my son, so you'll understand. Men understand. We see the world clearly. We know that sometimes you have to make hard choices. Sometimes you have to teach lessons. I hope when you're older we can talk man to man. I have so much to teach you. Love, Dad. Sarah felt Marcus tense beside her. This letter, she said carefully. Did you show anyone else? Police? A therapist? Michael shook his head. I was 18 and stupid. I thought it was just my dad being bitter about the divorce. I didn't think it meant anything. It means everything, Sarah said. This is a confession, or as close to one as we're likely to get. He's talking about the murders, the betrayal, the lessons, teaching you about his worldview. She looked at both brothers. I need you to think very carefully. Were there other letters? Did either of you ever meet with him after you left? No, Daniel said firmly. Never. Mom made sure of that. She moved us 3 times in 5 years, always using different addresses, different phone numbers. She was terrified he'd find us. Smart woman, Marcus muttered. Sarah pulled out a folder containing photographs of the 5 victims. I need to show you these women. I need you to tell me if you recognize any of them, if your father ever mentioned any of these names, anything at all. She laid the photos out on the table one by one. Young faces frozen in time, smiling at cameras in moments of joy they couldn't have known would be their last. Daniel studied each one with that same intense focus, his expression unreadable. Michael looked away after the first 2, his face pale. I don't recognize any of them, Daniel said finally. But I believe you. I believe he killed them. I've spent my whole life feeling like there was something poisonous in my blood, something I inherited from him that I have to constantly fight against. Sarah's training told her this was a moment to probe deeper, but her humanity told her to tread carefully. What do you mean by that? Daniel's hands curled into fists on the table. I have anger issues. Always have. When I get angry, really angry, I black out sometimes. I've been in therapy since I was 15. I've never hurt anyone, but I'm scared that I could. That's his legacy. That's what he gave me and my brother. The fear that we're monsters too. You're not, Sarah said firmly. You're sitting here helping us. You got help. You chose differently than he did. Did I choose? Daniel asked, his voice cracking slightly. Or did I just get lucky? If Mom hadn't left, if we'd grown up with him, would I be sitting in this booth or would I be in a case file somewhere? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Sarah had wondered the same thing about countless children of violent offenders she'd encountered over the years. Nature versus nurture, the eternal debate that offered no comfort to anyone involved. Michael suddenly spoke, his voice stronger now. I want to help. Whatever you need, files, interviews, DNA samples, anything. Those women, he gestured to the photos. They had families. They had futures. He took that. The least we can do is help you give their families some peace. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. This was the break they needed, the cooperation that would make everything else easier. We need you to go through any belongings of your father's that you might have. Photos, documents, anything. We need to map his movements, his relationships, his patterns. We don't have much, Daniel said. Mom threw most of it away. But there's a box in her garage. Old stuff from when they were married. She couldn't bring herself to look at it, but she couldn't throw it away either. You can have all of it. Marcus pulled out a card, sliding it across the table. We'll also need to interview your mother, if she's willing. Daniel's expression darkened. She's not willing. She has severe PTSD from her marriage to him. Just telling her about this investigation put her in the hospital for 2 days. She can't relive it. Sarah understood. We won't force anything. But if she changes her mind, if she remembers anything that might help, please call us. They talked for another hour, Sarah and Marcus walking the brothers through the timeline, explaining what they knew and what they were still trying to piece together. By the time they left the coffee shop, the rain had intensified, turning Portland's streets into rivers of gray water reflecting gray sky. Back in their rental car, Marcus turned to Sarah. Those boys are going to need serious therapy after this. They were already in therapy, Sarah replied. Now they just know why. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Vance. Press conference moved up to Friday. Media got wind of the story. It's already leaking. Get back to Houston ASAP. Sarah showed Marcus the message. He cursed quietly. So much for controlling the narrative. The flight back to Houston was turbulent, both literally and metaphorically. Sarah spent it reviewing her notes, preparing for the media storm that was about to break. By the time they landed, her phone was exploding with messages. News vans were already parked outside the sheriff's department. Reporters were calling the office, calling her personal number somehow, emailing, tweeting, demanding comments. If you're following this story, if you want to know how 41 years of silence finally broke, stick with us. This is just the beginning of understanding how one man's violence rippled across decades and thousands of miles. The next chapter reveals even more. The press conference was scheduled for 10 the next morning. Sarah had 18 hours to prepare to face the world and tell them about James Carver, serial killer, father, ex-husband, warehouse worker, ordinary monster who'd hidden in plain sight for 6 decades. The press conference room was packed beyond capacity, cameras forming a wall of glass eyes at the back, reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, the air thick with anticipation and the smell of coffee and rain-damp clothing. Sarah stood at the podium, Lieutenant Vance to her right, Marcus Webb to her left, and behind them, a screen displaying the official seal of the Harris County Sheriff's Department. Her hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium to keep them from shaking. She'd been up all night rehearsing, but now, facing the sea of expectant faces, her carefully prepared words felt hollow and insufficient. How do you summarize 41 years of grief, 5 stolen lives, and countless hours of investigation into a statement that would be edited down to 30-second sound bites? Good morning, Sarah began, her voice amplified through the microphone. On August 6, 1983, 23-year-old Jessica Marie Thornton was murdered in her Houston apartment. For 41 years, her family waited for answers. Today, we can finally provide them. The room erupted in a chaos of clicking cameras and murmured reactions. Sarah pressed on, outlining the basics of the case, the DNA breakthrough, the connection to 4 other murders across 3 decades. She named each victim slowly, deliberately, giving them the respect of being heard and remembered. James Edward Carver, deceased January 2019, has been identified through DNA evidence as the perpetrator of these 5 homicides. We believe there may be additional victims, and we are actively investigating his movements and associations from 1981 through 1995. The questions came like machine gun fire. Detective Chun, why did it take 41 years? How many more victims do you think there are? What about the families? Did Carver have any accomplices? Was he ever suspected before? Sarah answered what she could, deflected what she couldn't, and tried to keep the focus on the victims rather than the killer. But she could see the narrative already forming in the reporter's eyes. This would be a story about a monster who got away with it, who died peacefully while his victims stayed forever young in their graves. 30 minutes into the conference, a reporter from the Houston Chronicle stood up. Detective Chun, we've learned that you've been working cold cases for only 3 years. Some critics are saying this breakthrough is more about luck and technology than actual detective work. How do you respond to that? Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Solving cold cases requires both dedication and the advancement of forensic technology. Yes, the DNA database expansion was crucial, but someone had to recognize the significance of that match. Someone had to connect cases across multiple states and decades. Someone had to care enough to keep digging when it would have been easier to let these cases stay buried. That's not luck. That's the job. Lieutenant Vance stepped forward. Detective Chun has shown exemplary commitment to seeking justice for victims whose cases many had written off as unsolvable. The Harris County Sheriff's Department is proud of her work and the work of all the investigators involved in this case. Another reporter, this one from CNN, directed his question at Marcus. Detective Webb, you're weeks away from retirement. Why take on a 40-year-old case now? The evidence continued to mount. By August 2024, 5 months after the initial press conference, the task force had connected James Carver to 13 confirmed homicides and 8 probable additional cases where the evidence was strong but not definitive. 21 women, spanning 14 years, across 8 states. Sarah found herself becoming the face of the investigation, doing interviews with major news networks, sitting for podcast recordings, even being approached about a documentary. She hated the attention but understood its value. Every time she spoke about the case, more tips came in, more people remembered James Carver from their past, more pieces of the puzzle emerged. In September, Thomas Thornton called her. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. About Jessica still matching. I want to do something. I want to create a scholarship in her name for marine biology students. So her dream lives on even if she couldn't. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time since the investigation began. That's beautiful, Thomas. She would have loved that. And Catherine Sullivan, Amanda's sister, lived to see the case solved. She passed away in her sleep in early October, her daughter later telling Marcus that her mother's last words had been thank you. The task force was scheduled to release a comprehensive report in November, detailing every aspect of James Carver's life and crimes. It would be the most thorough profile of a deceased serial killer ever compiled, a resource for future investigators and a testament to the victims who deserved to be remembered. November 2024 arrived with unseasonably cold weather for Houston, the kind that made natives pull out jackets they wore maybe twice a year. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, adjusting her tie for the 10th time. Today was the day they'd present the final report on James Edward Carver to the public, to the families, to history. 6 months of relentless investigation compressed into a 300-page document that would serve as both indictment and epitaph for a man who'd never face a courtroom. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Big day. You ready? As ready as I'll ever be," she typed back. The presentation was being held at the FBI field office in Houston, a neutral ground that could accommodate the security requirements and the media presence. Sarah arrived an hour early to find the parking lot already half full, satellite trucks lining the street like mechanical sentinels. Inside, the conference room had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with rows of seats facing a raised platform where Sarah, Marcus, Lieutenant Vance, and FBI Special Agent Martinez would sit. The front rows had been reserved for the families. Sarah watched them file in, recognizing faces from months of phone calls and meetings. Thomas Thornton arrived with his wife and 2 teenage daughters, girls who'd never met their aunt but who wore photos of Jessica pinned to their shirts. Amanda Sullivan's daughter, now 43 years old, came with her own children, 3 generations united by a murder that had occurred before most of them were born. Rebecca Chen's parents, both in their 80s, were wheeled in by a nurse. They'd flown in from San Francisco despite their declining health, determined to hear the truth about their daughter's death. Melissa Rodriguez's brother carried a framed photo of his sister, her smile frozen at 24. Catherine Walsh's mother came alone, a small woman with white hair and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. But there were others too. A woman named Patricia Moore who'd been assaulted by James Carver in 1984 but had survived, fought him off with a kitchen knife. She'd reported it to police at the time, but without DNA evidence or witnesses, the case had gone nowhere. Now she sat in the 3rd row, her hands gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Next to her sat Diane Foster, who dated James briefly in 1987 and had broken up with him after he'd flown into a rage over a minor disagreement. She'd been 19, terrified, and had moved back to her parents' house 3 states away. For 37 years, she'd wondered if she'd overreacted. Now she knew she'd saved her own life. The room gradually filled. Journalists, law enforcement officials, forensic experts, victim advocates, and members of the public who'd followed the case. Daniel and Michael Carver were notably absent, and Sarah didn't blame them. This wasn't their story to witness. They'd provided what help they could and were now trying to rebuild their lives away from their father's shadow. At precisely 10 o'clock, Lieutenant Vance stepped to the podium. The room fell silent, that particular hush that comes when people are about to hear something they've waited decades to know. "Good morning," Lieutenant Vance began, her voice steady and authoritative. "6 months ago, Detective Sarah Chan stood before you and announced that we had identified James Edward Carver as the perpetrator in the murders of Jessica Thornton, Amanda Sullivan, Rebecca Chen, Melissa Rodriguez, and Catherine Walsh. Today, we're here to present the complete findings of our investigation, an investigation that has expanded far beyond those initial 5 cases." She stepped aside, and Sarah took her place at the podium. Her mouth was dry despite the water bottle in her hand, but her voice came out clear and strong. The James Carver Task Force, comprising law enforcement officials from 8 states and multiple federal agencies, has spent the last 6 months conducting the most comprehensive investigation into a serial offender that I have ever been part of. What we discovered goes beyond anything we initially anticipated. The screen behind her illuminated with a timeline, a visual representation of James Carver's life from birth to death, with red markers indicating confirmed murders and yellow markers indicating suspected crimes. James Edward Carver was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on March 15, 1962. His childhood was marked by instability. His father was an oil rig worker who was frequently absent, and his mother suffered from untreated mental illness. By age 14, James had his first arrest for assault, attacking a female classmate who'd rejected his advances. The charges were dropped when the girl's family moved away. This pattern, violence against women followed by avoidance of consequences, would define his entire life. Sarah walked through his history methodically. The move to Houston in 1981. The job at the Rusty Anchor. The first murder they could document, though she suspected there had been others. She explained how his journal, discovered by his sons, had provided the roadmap for understanding the full scope of his crimes. Based on physical evidence, DNA analysis, and James Carver's own written confessions in his journal, we have confirmed his involvement in 13 homicides between 1983 and 1995. She paused, letting that number sink in. 13 women whose lives were stolen. But our investigation suggests the actual number may be higher. The screen changed to show photographs of 8 additional women. These 8 cases remain open. We have strong circumstantial evidence linking James Carver to their disappearances or deaths, but not enough physical evidence to definitively close the cases. We continue to investigate. Sarah took the photo carefully, as if it were made of glass. "I'll never forget," she promised, "and I'll keep looking. For every woman he hurt, every family that's still waiting for answers. This case isn't closed until we've found them all." 3 years later, spring 2027, Sarah Chun stood in front of a lecture hall at the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The faces looking back at her were young, eager, belonging to law enforcement officers from across the country who'd come to learn about cold case investigation techniques. She was 44 now, the gray in her hair more pronounced, the lines around her eyes deeper from too many late nights and too much coffee. But there was something else in her expression too, something that hadn't been there before the Carver case. A quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that had been forged in the fire of hunting a dead man's crimes. The screen behind her displayed the now famous timeline, the one that had been reproduced in dozens of textbooks and training manuals. James Edward Carver, a case study in serial homicide investigation and the importance of multi-jurisdictional cooperation. She began her lecture the way she always did, with the faces: Jessica Thornton, Amanda Sullivan, Rebecca Chin, Melissa Rodriguez, Catherine Walsh, and the others, 16 more women whose cases had been definitively linked to Carver in the 3 years since the task force had released its initial report. 21 confirmed victims. The number had grown as the investigation continued, as more evidence was analyzed, as more connections were made. "These women are why we do this work," Sarah told the room. "Not for the glory, not for the headlines, but for them. And for their families who deserve answers." She walked them through the investigation methodically, sharing the breakthroughs and the dead ends, the moments of inspiration and the grinding, tedious work of following paper trails through decades of records. She talked about the importance of DNA databases, about recognizing patterns, about trusting instincts while following evidence. But she also talked about the failures. How James Carver had been reported multiple times for threatening behavior toward women. How those reports had been filed and forgotten, never compiled into a pattern that might have stopped him earlier. How systemic failures, underfunded police departments, lack of communication between jurisdictions, and a culture that didn't take violence against women seriously enough had allowed one man to kill for 14 years. "We can't bring these women back," Sarah said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But we can make sure that future offenders don't slip through the same cracks. We can build better systems, share information more effectively, and listen when women tell us they're afraid." After the lecture, during the question period, a young detective from Ohio raised her hand. "Detective Chin, I heard you left the Harris County Sheriff's Department last year. Can you talk about what you're doing now?" Sarah smiled. "I joined the FBI's cold case unit. I work specifically on cases involving serial offenders and unidentified victims. The Carver investigation taught me that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of cases out there that could be solved with the right attention and resources. So that's what I do now. I give them that attention. What she didn't mention in the lecture, what she kept private, was that the Carver case had changed her in ways that went beyond professional advancement. She'd started seeing a therapist herself, processing the secondary trauma of immersing herself in so much violence and death. She'd reconnected with her sister, whom she'd been estranged from for 5 years over something that now seemed trivial compared to the fragility of life the case had revealed. She'd even adopted a dog, a rescue named Luna who had anxiety issues that mirrored her own, and they'd healed together. Marcus Webb had retired 6 months after the final report was released, moving to a cabin in the mountains of North Carolina where he spent his days fishing and reading and not thinking about death. But he and Sarah still talked weekly, checking in on each other, sharing updates about the ongoing investigation, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence on the phone. Two people who'd stared into darkness together and survived. After the lecture, Sarah drove into Washington, D.C., where she had a meeting scheduled at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The Carver case had sparked a national conversation about cold cases and unidentified victims, leading to increased funding and support for organizations working to solve these cases. Sarah had become an advocate, testifying before Congress, consulting with police departments, and pushing for policy changes. But tonight's meeting was more personal. She was meeting with the family of a woman named Rebecca Winters, who disappeared in Phoenix in 1989. The family had reached out after seeing Sarah on a documentary about the Carver case, believing their loved one might have been another of his victims. Sarah had spent the last 6 months investigating, pulling records, analyzing evidence, looking for connections. Rebecca Winters' sister, Margaret, was 72 now, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea in her small apartment near DuPont Circle. Her daughter sat beside her, providing support, ready to catch her mother if the news was too much to bear. Sarah opened her file carefully. "I've completed my investigation into Rebecca's disappearance," she began gently. "And I need to be honest with you. I don't believe James Carver was responsible for what happened to her." Margaret's face fell, disappointment and relief warring in her expression. "Then who?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted. "But Rebecca's case doesn't fit Carver's pattern. The circumstances are different, the timeline doesn't work, and there's no evidence placing him in Phoenix when she disappeared. However," she paused, pulling out another file, "I've identified 3 other cases from that same area and time frame that have similarities to Rebecca's disappearance. I believe there may have been a different offender operating in Phoenix in the late 80s, and I've opened an investigation into those cases." Margaret started crying, but they were complicated tears. "So we still don't know what happened to her." "Not yet," Sarah said. "But I'm not giving up. And more importantly, neither should you. The Carver case taught us that answers can come after decades. Technology improves. Witnesses come forward. Evidence gets re-examined with fresh eyes. Your sister's case is not cold to me. It's active, and I'm working on it." She left Margaret's apartment feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with giving families hope. Hope was a dangerous thing to offer, easily shattered, but Sarah had learned that it was also necessary. Without hope, families gave up. Without hope, cases truly did go cold. Her phone rang as she walked to her car. The caller ID showed Thomas Thornton. She answered immediately. "Thomas, everything okay?" "Better than okay," Thomas said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "I wanted to let you know that the first Jessica Marie Thornton Memorial Scholarship has been awarded. She's a graduate student at UC San Diego, studying coral reef restoration. Her name is Maria Rodriguez. She's Melissa Rodriguez's niece." Sarah stopped walking, overcome with emotion. The symmetry of it, the connection between victims' families finding solidarity and purpose, was almost too much to process. "That's beautiful, Thomas. That's absolutely beautiful. She's brilliant just like Jessica was," Thomas continued. "And she told me that she's dedicating her research to all the women whose lives were cut short. She said that every discovery she makes, every reef she helps save, is in their memory. She understands that her opportunity came from tragedy, and she's determined to honor that. After hanging up with Thomas, Sarah sat in her car for a long moment, thinking about Circle's closing and legacies living on. Daniel and Michael Carver had both changed their names, seeking distance from their father's crimes. Daniel had become a therapist specializing in helping children of violent offenders. Michael worked for a nonprofit that supported victims of domestic violence. They'd taken the poison of their father's legacy and transmuted it into something healing. Patricia Moore, the survivor, had written a book about her experience, becoming an advocate for believing women when they reported feeling unsafe. Her memoir had spent 12 weeks on the bestseller list and had sparked countless conversations about intuition, fear, and the importance of trusting women's experiences. The documentary about the case had won an Emmy. The podcast had been downloaded millions of times. But more importantly, it had led to tips that helped solve 6 other cold cases across the country. People had come forward with information they'd held onto for years, inspired by seeing that old cases could still be solved, that their memories and observations still mattered. Sarah's own life had transformed in unexpected ways. She'd met someone, another FBI agent named David, who worked in the behavioral analysis unit. He understood the demands of the job, the way cases could consume you, the need to sometimes just sit in silence and decompress. They were taking it slow, but for the first time in years, Sarah could imagine a future that included more than just work and cold cases. She started her car and began the drive back to her apartment in Alexandria. Luna would be waiting, probably having destroyed another throw pillow in her anxiety, but Sarah didn't mind. They were both works in progress, both learning to live with the shadows while reaching toward the light. Her phone buzzed with an email. Another family reaching out, another case they hoped she could help solve. Sarah read it at a red light, already mentally cataloging the details, already planning her approach. Some people might see it as an inability to let go, an obsession that bordered on unhealthy. But Sarah saw it as purpose. As long as there were families waiting for answers, as long as there were victims whose stories hadn't been told, there was work to do. The Carver case had taught her that justice might be delayed, but it didn't have to be denied. That the dead could still speak through evidence and DNA and the dedication of people who refused to forget them. That every victim mattered, whether they'd been gone for 1 year or 41. She thought about Jessica Thornton, who'd wanted to save the oceans. About Amanda Sullivan, who'd worn yellow sundresses and had an infectious laugh. About Rebecca Chin, who'd fought back. About Melissa Rodriguez and Catherine Walsh and all the others whose lives had been full of dreams and plans and futures that James Carver had stolen. They were more than victims now. They were catalysts for change. They were the reason police departments had updated their protocols. They were the reason DNA databases had been expanded. They were the reason Sarah and hundreds of other investigators got up every morning and chose to wade into the darkness, looking for light. As Sarah pulled into her parking space, her phone rang one more time. It was the lab. They'd found a DNA match in another old case, this one from 1987 in New Mexico. Not connected to Carver, but to a different unsolved murder. Another family about to get answers. Another circle about to close. Sarah answered the call, Luna's excited barking already audible through her apartment door. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new families in need of closure. But tonight, there was this moment, this small victory, this reminder that the work mattered. And that was enough.